Hello, everyone, and welcome to Food Safety Matters, the podcast for food safety professionals. I'm Stacey Atchison, publisher of Food Safety Magazine, and I want to thank you for joining us for this special bonus episode. Today, Food Safety Magazine's editorial director and co-host of the podcast, Adrian Bloom, sits down with Sally Powell-Price and Justice Jedlicka of MilliporeSigma for a conversation that covers the evolving definition of food risk, the growing importance of environmental monitoring and rapid microbiological testing, and how industry and regulators can work together to address novel foods, supply chain challenges, and emerging contamination threats. And they also explore what it takes to build a more agile food safety system, one that can anticipate risks and respond proactively before they become public health events. It's going to be a great conversation. But before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about our guests. Sally Powell-Price joined MilliporeSigma in 2020 as a regulatory subject matter expert for public health, focusing on food safety, testing, and environmental monitoring in North America. Previously, she served as food and environmental lab supervisor at the New York City Department of Health Public Health Laboratory and as director of lab operations at a Boston-based startup. She holds a bachelor's degree in biology from Hamilton College and a master's degree in microbiology and immunology from James Cook University, Australia, and completed her professional training at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She currently co-chairs both the International Government Relations Committee and the Laboratory Science and Technology Committee for the Association of Food and Drug Officials, or AFDO. She's a member of the WHO Food Safety Communities of Practice and has served as an advisory panel member for several AOAC international working groups. Justice Jedlicka works in North America commercial applications for food, beverage, and industrial regulatory for MilliporeSigma, where she's responsible for engaging with influencers in the food and beverage industry to align initiatives with regulatory compliance and promote best practices for food safety and quality testing methods. Justice has been serving the food safety and beverage industry since 2013 and received both a bachelor's degree in chemistry and an MBA degree from the University of Missouri in St. Louis. She previously served as the chair of the Food Sciences section for the American Council of Independent Labs and currently serves on the Food Science section executive committee at ACIL and the board of directors for the Independent Lab Institute. Okay, now let's get to their discussion.
So today we're exploring how regulators, laboratories, and food manufacturers are responding to emerging food safety risks in an increasingly complex landscape. And I am joined by Sally Price and Justice Jedlicka of MilliporeSigma to discuss regulatory agility, rapid response strategies, and the challenges of staying ahead of evolving threats. So welcome back to the podcast, Sally and Justice. It's great to have you back.
We're so happy to be here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely. So, just to kind of jump in and set the stage a little bit here. So, what emerging food risks are currently keeping North American regulators up at night? Sally, maybe you can tip us off on some of these things.
Sure. Thanks, Adrian. I think the short answer is a lot of them. There's a lot of things happening nowadays in terms of food risks, but I think if you sat down with a bunch of not even just North American food regulators, just international regulators, you'd hear a consistent cluster of concerns. The most recent one that comes to mind, right, is listeria. We're seeing here in the U.S. there's kind of this movement towards raw milk, and kind of other movement towards raw products. And so listeria is really kind of gaining some traction in terms of outbreak. So that's really questionable and problematic. We're also seeing kind of a lot of events around infant formula, and I know we've had a lot of this topic in other podcasts. Brought with Chronobacter in the past couple of years ago, and then more recently, C. botulinum, those spore formers, so CBOT, and then even in Europe, which then translated into the U.S., cereulide, which is a toxin from Bacillus cereus, and those aren't obscure pathogens, right? So even though these are keeping everyone up at night, they're dangers that they're well characterized. We have tools to detect and control them, but what the problem is that they're still causing illness and death. And that tells us the system isn't catching them, right? And so the FDA's root cause analysis following infant formula, that gave us a lot of answers in terms of the events that took place. But the contamination events are still happening. They're still causing problems. And I just wanted to outline something that was really sobering for me this week was on Food Safety Day, the WHO released a press release with a Lancet article attached, estimating the number of global foodborne illnesses at 866 million. You heard me correctly, 866 million people globally get sick from foodborne illness. When you push that to the US, we're seeing about 48 million annual illnesses from foodborne disease. And that's if you do the math, we have 350 million Americans. We have 1 in 7 roughly that are getting sick from foodborne illness still. So what that's showing, and those stats are not really losing the power to shock you, we're seeing that we have these new threats and then these persistent old threats, and we're not addressing them fast enough. And I think regulators are seeing that, they're understanding that. And then the most pressing examples, right, are the things we're seeing in the news now. We have in the past year and a half, avian influenza hitting cattle. And we're lucky in terms of understanding the mechanism of that, the food risks of that. And then New World screwworm, which is affecting the food industry as well. And the USDA is doing a lot of pivots to address that. So unfortunately, the things keeping them all up at night right now is that the hazard landscape is ever shifting, and we are just trying to keep up and also maintain those consumer safety pieces.
And Sally, the one thing I would love to add to that, I think I think it still kind of revolves around testing, as really that best way to actually get a picture of what's happening and give both regulators and the industry the data that they need to act. You can have the best food safety plan on paper, but without a robust microbiological testing, whether it be raw materials, finished products, just kind of critically thinking through your manufacturing environment, you're flying blind in the dark. And that's really kind of that message, that needs to be brought home is, how do we invest in the right infrastructure regarding testing, and really have it down before something goes wrong, not after, so that we're talking more about preventative action as opposed to becoming one of these new WHO statistics, and kind of thinking, 2026 is the 15-year anniversary of FSMA. So some things have changed and some things have kind of stayed the same. So, kind of the questions I would think regulators are staying up at night about would be, how do we elevate and amplify this groundwork? And then what comes next?
Agree with you, Justice.
And, so when we're looking at some of the recent contamination events that have been high profile and that, we've seen regulators address or, saying that they're going to address, Sally, that you mentioned, and then also, these new statistics we have that tell us how many people, both in, the US and worldwide in other countries, are getting sick from foodborne illnesses each year. When we're looking at North America, how would you say that the definition of food risk has evolved over the last decade? Justice, any thoughts?
Absolutely. I'm thinking about a decade, probably a little more ago, is probably when I first shifted markets to really focusing on food safety in my scientific career. And food risk really kind of felt like it was about the pathogens. And we talked about salmonella, E. coli, O157, listeria, and those are still very important and really central to a good food risk safety plan. But it kind of seems like there's a lot of higher stakes these days, especially with antimicrobial resisting changing, the clinical severity of some of these infections. And then also the definition has really broadened, I think. Today, we also consider the way we think about our food safety system and where it gets affected. I'm thinking now we have DoorDash, Uber Eats. Shoot, even we have Walmart grocery delivery now and Whole Foods with Amazon. There's just so much available to us at a moment's notice, and these weren't even concepts or things available when FSMA was created. Definitely not just coming into inception maybe 10 years ago, but now they're an everyday occurrence. So we're starting to see that as we layer in all these different intricacies into the food system, that cold chain has some more gaps and the traceability, more blind spots. And then consumer expectations, we want more, faster now, are outpacing the safety infrastructure that we have designed that really came about from a slower, simpler food distribution world. So the definition needed to evolve.
That more faster now. Wow, that really really captures it, Justice. I just want to add that from the regulatory standpoint too, they've had to keep up with all these integrations, right? And so I think what's shifted when we talk about, food risk is the recognition, you mentioned it a little bit about supply chain. Supply chain's a food risk, and you really have to have these cross collaborations to illuminate that between the regulators, between industry, between other stakeholders. We saw it really come into play during COVID, of course. And we saw it again with the infant formula shortage, right? That led to Operation Stork Speed. It led to all of these, it led to actually essentially a public health emergency when we had to recall so much product. And so having to kind of pivot and regulators had to shift, our import requirements had to shift. Really to kind of accommodate that. We've also seen kind of these changes with FDA's new era for smarter food safety blueprint, where they try to acknowledge that traditional inspect respond model really wasn't working. It wasn't enough. We need that end-to-end traceability, as you said. Um, and we also need kind of additional surveillance and adapting our tools, looking to the digital element of that, where we can maybe do better predictive intelligence. It's not there yet, but integrating that into how we are assessing risk. And again, like as I said, we really need this holistic cross collaboration between the stakeholders and industry to better kind of understand what the risks are, where they're going, and really just have this fundamental philosophical shift of how do you assess food risk, and maybe that needs to be evaluated much more frequently and at a much deeper level than it currently is.
Yeah, and when we look at the regulatory landscape and the different tools that are available, to help regulators address, not only are we looking at different microbiological and chemical things and contamination events, but we're also looking at different types of foods, different processing, and of course, as you mentioned, Justice, consumers are preferring different delivery methods and things like that. So everything is changing, and it all feeds into the evolving regulatory landscape. And so I guess with all of these things in mind, my next question would be, how are regulators approaching these new and emerging food risks differently? And, where do they kind of align?
I think this is an interesting trend that I've really been watching lately and kind of excited to see where it goes. It seems, the more recent trend, even for consumers, is to bring things closer to home, more localization. Traditionally, it's been a top-down approach where everybody looks to the federal level oversight, and then it may or may not trickle down pretty cohesively down to the local controls and regulations. But it really kind of seems that maybe we're looking at localization to really drive what happens nationally for us. And I would say the USDA is probably the best example I can see right now, whereas they're going through their reorganization, and they've been moving their food regulators into the states where they operate. I'm so excited that one of those ends up being the new office that's in St. Louis, which is near and
Mm-hmm.
dear to my heart. So it's kind of fun and kind of interesting to see, because you would think the regulators need to be where they're regulating. So it's kind of an interesting change. And then also, most recently, the USDA Undersecretary Dr. Mindy Bashir's, her work has been influential in driving that kind of decentralized, relationship-based regulatory approach. And the FDA's collaboration with the Office of Seafood is another great example. Just creating these more targeted, specialized oversight for product categories that have unique microbiological risk profiles. And that alignment is happening not just through uniformity, but also through shared frameworks and communication channels. So it doesn't feel so big and broad and all encompassing. It feels localized, smaller, more concierge, if you will, to your local community needs.
Yeah, Justice, I like how you put that, because I think, even internationally, I think we're seeing a little bit more alignment through the state, local, municipal level, and then even federally, some of that kind of international discussion. We talk about GFSI alignment, right, with those standards and SQF, and they require specific kind of preventative control frameworks and testing programs for pathogens, which then can be translated to a novel food landscape, right? And that can also help kind of more uniform risk assessments and collaboration for those types of foods. I'd say like the preventative control piece of that's the most common ground where you can kind of build on for whatever novel commodity that you're addressing. I think where the gap widens in how you're approaching novel foods might be around some of the categories that are more nuanced, ferment, or what do I want to say? Precision fermented ingredients, precision fermented items. We're also looking at cultivated products, right? Cultivated meat, cultivated proteins. And I would say that one's a little bit more um, cut out because you've seen some actually remarkable collaboration between the FDA and USDA on cultivated meat products. That's a really nice example of how those different agencies can come together. And even internationally, you're seeing a lot of knowledge sharing through the Good Food Institute and through others where you can kind of help do that risk assessment together. But that being said, I would say novel foods in general are still really an active area of policy development, and you need to use these good models to build on it. And that's really how you can do your best risk assessments as a regulator and then also as an industry that wants to collaborate.
Yeah, certainly, the different regulatory concerns about novel foods. We've been hearing a lot more about precision fermentation, Food Safety Magazine recently, and, been exploring that area. But I guess I want to go back to a few of the things that Justice said about, in the regulatory landscape, things becoming more localized, and what the USDA is doing, and kind of how the evolution of where food safety and public health is intersecting, like at what levels. So I guess another thing I would love to hear your thoughts on is if you think North American regulatory frameworks that we have right now are built for speed, or do you think they're inherently reactive?
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. I think historically they've been built for rigor, right? So not one or the other. They've been built to be prescriptive and stringent as possible for protection. And there was a reason for that. There was a reason for how things were established initially. They've been evolving. I think rigor and speed are sometimes nowadays at odds, and we don't necessarily see always the movement at the speeds maybe that need to happen. FSMA was a good example, Justice touched on this, where we really saw this monumental shift and this evolution from that reactive to proactive. That's huge, but the rulemaking process, it's slow by design, right? So you have, and it's slow by design because the regulators want to have the input of industry, of the experts who are the boots in the ground to get that input. So that's absolutely the right intent. I would say the result of that, unfortunately, is that a new food safety rule legislation can take months to years to actually be enacted. And there may be a public health cost to that, and there may be a One Health cost to that. And so you have to be able to see, more genuine speed or some compromise between the speed and the inclusion, right, of the correct stakeholders to be part of that. I will say, counter to that, in terms of our ability to respond quickly, there has been a genuine change in crisis response. I'd say we're seeing faster recall mechanisms generally. We're seeing coordinated alerts, right, between the FDA and these core programs. Even through CFIA in Canada, we're seeing these kind of coordinated responses. The public and local health levels are also really good at collaborating with their states. So we see this improved trace back, right, with genomic technologies. Whole genome sequencing especially is a big one. I worked with the New York City Department of Health 10 years ago, and we were just getting our whole genome sequencing platforms online. And I'll tell you that the labor change that allowed and the rapidity of which you could respond to an outbreak was very abrupt. And it was really exciting to see that kind of innovation. But I think just on the point of your question, though, we still need to be able to have a root cause investigation. We still need to be able to react quickly and have some sort of compromise between the regulatory system and have a truly agile system that can both catch environmental contamination systems sooner, or environmental contaminants sooner, but that we also still have room to grow in order to translate that into some sort of regulation.
And Sally, I would totally tag on to that. I kind of think about the framework a little bit as an kind of like if you think about an architecture or plans to build, that perfect model. But as you're building it, you realize that the engine that you put in this amazing thing just isn't quite fast enough to keep up with all of the demands, the changing innovation. And so, how do you adapt and stopping so reactive and able to be proactive and then head it off at the pass, if you will? And really getting ahead of some of these novel microbial threats before they cause illness. The system just isn't quite set up that way just yet. And this is kind of where how Sally mentioned that environmental monitoring becomes so critical. Um, because a well-designed environmental monitoring program, especially in a food manufacturing facility, is essentially its early warning system. It lets you know, oh my goodness, yes, we might be having an listeria situation. Let's look for more information. We are having such a tough time getting rid of the salmonella. And oh no, the serotype we just found, it's one of the emerging AMR strains. What do we do? So this gap, that is not every facility has one, but not every regulator is ready to set up the specific framework ready to address it fully and comprehensively. And so that's why it's so critical and important for science partners and industry kind of to lead this, work together, collaborate, and see how we can get ahead of this before it becomes an outbreak.
Absolutely. And, kind of with that regulatory background that we just laid out, and then also looking at, how can industry adapt to, not only these, developments in the regulatory landscape, but also, these emerging food safety risks, emerging concerns for novel foods, different things that are going on with pathogens and other contamination pathways. I think there's a lot of opportunity for innovation here. And that leads into my next question is, how do food manufacturers and test developers balance that kind of speed to market with regulatory compliance in that evolving risk landscape that we're looking at? And, what would a rapid response look like?
Adrienne, that's a really great question because being in business, speed to market is critical to your success. But you have to consider safety, and that regulatory compliance sometimes feels like an obstacle that just butts up right against your speed to market. But companies that do it well figure out that the answer really is investment in environmental monitoring and real-time microbiological data, especially with all of the new AI technology that's evolving, innovating, coming our way. It seems that in theory, all the tools are there to help us just eliminate food safety risk. However, you still have to do the work. And, when your environmental monitoring program is agile and robust, your data is clean, it gives you that evidence to move forward fast. And because you're not scrambling to understand your facility's baseline microbial profile, definitely is important that you're not doing that or learning that right in the middle of a crisis, that you ask those important questions, you find out that information prior to it becoming a problem. Because rapid response isn't always about reacting faster. It's about knowing your environment so well that you can detect a deviation before it ever becomes an event. And that's kind of that mind shift change that we're just now wrapping our heads around.
Yeah, Justice, I love how you put that because rapid response, I think everyone thinks, oh, there's an outbreak that triggers the response to something. But in my head and coming from the public health lab space, rapid response is one that you don't have to respond to with illness and with others getting sick. It's something that you've caught early before it's really a problem. And I think that's, like you said, that mindset shift of making sure that your facilities are thinking that way, the industry is thinking that way, and regulators are thinking that way. And with that point, I'd say the way that you can help control for that, you touched on it already, environmental monitoring, that's the emphasis. We got to just talk about how I think that's underappreciated as a public health tool, preventative tool at the level that it is. People are sometimes ticking a box and not necessarily thinking, hey, this is actually the first step I'm taking to protect my consumers and protect people's health and safety. And if you have a rigorous EM program that has the right indicator or and making sure it's the right one, I should say, a rigorous one that's correct and right for what you are testing for. You're looking for your indicator organisms, whether you're talking to Listeria or Salmonella or others, you're running it consistently and thoroughly, and your staff are trained. You have the right media, the right sampling protocols, the right frequency. It's giving you this kind of full living picture of your facility, and their micro status, as you said, right? And also looking at your other hazards, right? A good HACCP plan will also put this into place, or a food safety plan. So when that picture actually changes, as you said, you can act quickly before products affected. That's a rapid response. And the data from that program can also become invaluable for public health experts, for public health regulators, to demonstrate to them that you're being proactive, but also potentially be a tool further down the road to support others, and provide that bigger One Health context.
Interesting. And, with a lot of the stuff we've been talking about here, there's obviously, tension between food innovation and regulatory readiness in North America. Sally, where would you say that the tension is greatest when you're looking at
Yeah.
that
Thanks,
area?
Adrienne, for the question. I think, yeah, we touched on this a little bit. I really want to hit back, I guess, in the novel food manufacturing. I think that's where we're still seeing this gap. You're producing this cultivated product, whether it's in a bioreactor, precision fermented, like we are talking about, in a novel facility design. The question of, whether your environmental monitoring program what that looks like is still kind of open.
Hmm.
Traditional EM programs, like we talked about, they're designed for traditional food manufacturing environments. And does the same approach apply when your raw material is cell culture? Which is a question, right? I think the FDA and USDA have been doing a good job working with industry to address that. But which organisms are good indicator organisms? What does the food safety plan for that kind of facility look like? Maybe the risks are not as high as they would be for traditional product, but how can you prove that and make sure that's the case? And I'd say like the timeline gap maybe between the novel food category commercializing, as we said, and the development of kind of appropriate testing standards for it, whether that's sample size or the micro test specifically, or any other number of factors. Um, you know, there's a risk that you're not necessarily doing it right, and there's a risk to the regulators that they're over-regulating a product that maybe needs other risk assessment. I'd also just say the other piece to that is selecting the right partners. So making sure, the other tension piece would be if you're a up-and-coming industry and you're choosing the right testing partners to help provide you those answers that maybe the regulators don't have yet, to have that correct kind of horizon scanning, um, in their vision. I think that's also pretty important and helps to maybe relieve some of that tension that we discussed.
And Sally, I was also kind of thinking about it a little bit from a consumer standpoint. That tension really is amplified as technology is changing and the way people you'd receive their food.
Yeah.
We are starting to see AI enabled cooking appliances that, you could be at work, off outside of your home and turn your oven on and have your food ready for you once you arrive at home. We have smart refrigerators that tell you, what your shopping list is, which is awesome, by the way, and direct to consumer delivery models. And these are just creating new handling and storage scenarios that food safety regulations, they weren't they weren't ready for that. Until now. No. But really, it poses the question, who's responsible for the cold chain integrity of some of these meal kits that get delivered to a consumer? Sally and I were
Oh
chatting
yeah, you
the
told
other
me
day about this
Yeah.
earlier this week because I recently moved into the country and my nearest grocery store is about a half an hour away from where I live. And right. So I'm a food safety risk, but just kind of considering, I was so very excited that there is a very large retail outlet that will now deliver to my neighborhood. So I'm very excited. So I'm prepping for a barbecue that I had at my house over the weekend. I had to get my house clean was more important than going to the grocery store. So I had, raw hamburger delivered, ice cream delivered, countless other things delivered. And thank goodness I ordered wine and other beverages because I had to ensure that somebody was at the house. Because if I would have been busy super cleaning with the vacuum running, I would never have answered the door to the gentleman. And who knows how long that would have been out when it was almost 95 degrees over the weekend. So, not necessarily the best safety situation. And I do love my delivery driver, but have never been in his vehicle, so I don't know how he has that set up. Does he have areas for cold storage? You know, what does that look like? Does he have my bags in with other people's bags? I don't know what's going on there. So is that a risk we need to start considering? I hope so, because I mean, if you think about it, these are real microbiological risks, and honestly, Listeria, Salmonella, they don't care that your meal is ordered through an app. They're gonna get you if they're gonna get you.
How
So
rude. They don't consider your
I know
timeline.
they
No.
don't. I don't know what they're, but but honestly, the regulatory frameworks are generally just trying to catch up with this ever-changing consumer landscape. And what does that look like going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, during this discussion, we're talking about a lot of different emerging risks. And so, Justice, a question that I have kind of as a follow-on to what you and Sally have been talking about is, our contract labs and testing partners, are they equipped to keep pace with these emerging risks that we've been discussing?
I have actually been thinking about that a lot, especially this year, as I'm a member of the American Council of Independent Labs in the food science section, and I get to interact with some of the contract labs and kind of learn and understand do they deal with these risks, and how do they keep up. And I think one of the great examples that I've recently heard was in March, ACIL and FDA had a technical sharing session. And during that session, a contract testing lab actually provided a case study example of a rapid response during an outbreak. And it was amazing how nuanced it was and what they considered. And at the end of the day, really what they needed to do was make decisions quickly. Not that they're not doing the regulation, but sometimes in tandem with that, you have to do whatever it is because you have to get answers to questions quickly, and you can't do a method that takes 7 days when people have the potential for illness or even death. You have to come up with your own lab developed test. It may not be a fully validated method, but whatever gets you to that answer to save people's lives, that is what you have to decide is most important. And just always moving forward, but make sure obviously you're doing the good lab practices on the back end. But yeah, anything you can do to just move it forward and protect consumer safety, that's kind of really the goal, as I've been learning and seeing, and have learned from specific case studies on it happening in real time. And then Sally, I think you, from your public health labs experience, you had seen this in action too.
Yeah, I mean, you said where labs have to operate in this way, this operational agility that they have to respond to something quickly that maybe there isn't a standard for, or maybe you don't have time to do the standard before you have some answer you need to be able to act on or have to act on to protect the public health kind of spectrum. And I mentioned I already touched on the whole genome sequencing innovations there that are ongoing and continuing, and that was a real capacity shift we saw. And it was really incredible to be there at the beginning of that. We worked alongside the CDC and some of these other big agencies and states to make that happen, and it was really impressive. I'm very proud of that time. I would say that, on the other side, we're talking about novel foods, we're talking about some of these other products, like how do we work with this kind of public health mindset, this One Health mindset, not as a regulator, but just whether we're a testing lab or others. I think we think about MilliporeSigma, like our company, we work with a lot of third-party labs to help them kind of horizon scan and better understand what are some of the risks coming down the road, not necessarily ones that are just listed on the compliance tick box now. We just had a webinar actually a couple weeks ago discussing how do you select that novel contract testing partner, and what's the best case scenario for what they can provide for you to make sure not only are you compliant, but you're actually getting ahead of whatever risks the regulators may find later on. So I just think, the labs and partners who are most equipped to deal with any upcoming problems are the ones who are already thinking about it and proving that they are and making those innovations early without just ticking a box.
And, so kind of moving from what an adaptive response from, labs and testing partners looks like, what does a truly agile regulatory response look like? And, does that exist yet in North America? Justice, do you have any thoughts?
Um, I'm thinking it really, at the end of the day, comes down to industry collaboration and a food safety culture. I I would consider this more than any single regulation or technology that's available. It's just kind of that marriage of collaboration, culture, and it's kind of exciting right now to see this growing movement toward public-private partnerships as well in food safety. I've never, as long as I've been in the food and beverage market, I've never seen the FDA and USDA be so openly collaborative and really explore, because you don't know what you don't know, to be trite, but it's true. And starting to ask those questions, learning new information, and then industry too, and technology providers as far as thinking, what if, what could. And so we're starting to, as a technology provider, innovate not just what's on available and what's needed, but really kind of think about what do customers actually need and what will they need as things are evolving and changing. And that's starting to get more and more translated into different regulatory guidances in food and beverage. And you kind of got to consider, you know, all the different people who are in the room when these conversations happen. So perhaps we have a regulatory update on salmonella guidance. Well, are you talking qualification of salmonella? Are we talking serotypes? Are we just talking salmonella in general? So having the right mix of scientists, regulators, industry operators, testing partners, whoever it is, these are the important people that are starting to collaborate more effectively. And I think that's where agility kind of begins with these emerging threats. I mean, we've already seen this with AMR, HPAI, Chronobacter. We hadn't even really considered those in all the areas that we do today. And so it just tells us that we have to keep up with this constant dynamic communication. And that's pretty exciting because we will never be a stale environment.
That's true,
Which is also a food safety risk, I'm thinking.
we'll never be boring. I'll say that. Yeah, and I completely agree with you, right? Like I'd say the responsibility sits really with both sides of the conversation, right? We have to be talking to industry. They have to show up with the data, the operational transparency from industry. There's responsibility there. And then regulators have to create clear channels where those inputs, right, and are genuinely heard and acted upon, or at least discussed beyond, closed doors. I will say, and I'll make a shameless plug for organizations like AFDO, right, the Association of Food and Drug Officials. They play a critical role in kind of bridging that academic, government, industry conversation on a lot of topics of food safety and food concern. Regulatory restructuring we've seen, as you said, Justice, with USDA and FDA kind of repositioning. That's obviously movement in a good direction. We want to see, kind of remains to be seen what that results in terms of how that plays out from the public health side. But these sector-specific relationships are important. And that's also a step in the right direction. So just say overall, the conversations just have to keep going, like you said, and we have to keep pushing the right direction. They are moving the right way, but we still need to make them happen.
So, Sally, I kind of think an example of where we've seen this in the market play out is in all the recent infant formula events. They just seem to be a great case study on both failures and possibilities for agile response. There were failures that were documented, inspection gaps, environmental monitoring that wasn't capturing Chronobacter, communication issues. But the response, once it was triggered, showed what's possible: rapid regulatory mobilization, coordinated communication, and accelerated investigation. So the thing I'm thinking about moving forward is, how do we get to that level of responsiveness operating as a default and not just the crisis exception, to where this is the culture, where we're in this mode, but it doesn't seem as rapid because we're not reacting, we're being proactive.
Yeah, I mean, we're touching on this, right? The agility has to be your early warning systems, environmental monitoring programs, right? We talked about that and that supply chain surveillance, making sure that it's sensitive enough to catch what you need to catch. And then I'd also just say, you know, we like to see our partners that treat their EM micro testing data as a continuous intelligence feed, right? It's not just checking a box. They're asking, what's this data telling me? Where are my systems heading? Am I going in the right direction? And not just whether, I passed or failed today. And I'd say, we have technology ready to support that, right, Justice? You can speak on that.
Yeah, I was going to say, yes, the technology is there. And I think that this kind of played in also on the infant and toddler food with the heavy metals. We really saw that where consumers knew that we had this technology able to detect heavy metals at the smallest atomic level, but they created the Closer to Zero program around that because it's when these metals are in our environment naturally, we're going to detect them. Now, does that prove toxicology or toxicity? We have to do the toxicology studies to ensure that answer. But definitely, we have the ability to create this technology, the innovation. So the bottleneck isn't science, it's building the governance frameworks for acting on predictive signals. And that requires a kind of trust and sustained collaboration between regulators and industry, and just really fostering that collaboration and culture that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and I can just bring, I guess, this question kind of to a close and just saying like the most agile companies that we see that we work with, and I would just brag on our end, they're companies that invest in those um, workers who have a full-time job might be horizon scanning, right? Watching academic literature, watching the regulatory dockets, watching the global outbreak patterns, look at the new pathogen characterizations, really just being on top of all those facets. They're not waiting for the guidance to come out to tell them new risk exists. They're already building their testing response ahead. They are the ones who were seeing the data, for example, on HPAI months and months before maybe even regulators were working on it. That's kind of the organizational muscle that you need when you're working in the food safety space and any One Health space, I would argue. And it's a muscle you have to train before you need it, not during an emergency. You have to be able to put that out there right within your organization or within your partner, right? Whether it's a testing partner or within your organization, you're valuing that muscle to be used and operationalized.
So, when we're talking about both regulatory and industry response to all these different emerging risks, all these different trends we've been talking about today, how are companies future proofing their testing and compliance strategies? Because that's a big part of it.
Yeah, absolutely, Adrian. And I kind of touched on this just now, but just saying, that forward thinking agile culture isn't just kind of this broad philosophical adoption. It's you have to have different kinds of agilities. So one would be digital agility. Obviously, you can't talk about anything these days without mentioning artificial intelligence. I would say integrating that with caution and understanding that it is not foolproof. It requires the right inputs, just like your science is only as good as your assay. Whatever you get out of a AI is only as good as what's in it. And so just being aware of that piece. I'd also just say, looking at sampling designs, risk assessments for more dynamic landscape, right? Acting on that horizon scanning I mentioned, creating it as a strategy, not just a response. Where your traditional sampling plans we know weren't designed for this evolving landscape. So making sure that we're staying on top of it. And then third, I just say kind of critically validating for where requirements and risks are going. So validate what you've already established, not where they are today, where they are tomorrow. If you're validating a method that meets current regs, you're already behind. So making sure obviously your test methods and everything else aligns with current requirements, absolutely, but ensuring that those are malleable enough to go the next step when they need to and validate that for what the science says is coming.
And Sally, I would also add that the FDA's traceability rule is forcing a lot of companies to build the data infrastructure backbone that the modern food safety actually requires. And the companies embracing that proactively are in a much stronger position than those scrambling at the deadline, as you mentioned. When your traceability is robust, your outbreak response is fundamentally faster. That's not abstract. We saw that demonstrated clearly in how quickly traceback moves once data is assembled. That traceability and microbiological testing are just two sides on the same coin if you think about it.
Yeah, and that goes back to the supply chain and cold chain, right? Traceability as well. We're just talking about Walmart, right? And other big suppliers like the retailers that deliver to your house in the middle of nowhere, right? You have, not that you live in the middle of nowhere, but you know what I mean.
It's the middle of nowhere,
It's
but I
far.
love it.
But but just being able to, right, how do we risk assess for that? And also work, you have all these industries at odds and at tension, right? And making sure that they're doing the right thing. And also if you have someone who's just a driver bringing food to you, understanding that that person also needs to understand, what are some of the safety risks of the product they transport. So how do we integrate those two things? So I think altogether, right, it's that holistic approach.
Yeah, so given the evolving risk landscape we're in and the stress that we've placed on the need to be agile and forward looking, which I think is a resounding theme of what we're talking about here today, to kind of bring it all back to the role that scientific partners like MilliporeSigma play in helping both regulators and manufacturers maintain that agility in this evolving food risk landscape. Any thoughts?
So I can speak as to MilliporeSigma and our broader role as a serious scientific partner, one that's committed to solving the toughest problems in life science because it's what we do as a scientific organization in food safety specifically. And that means being present at every critical juncture of the microbiological testing workflow, whether that's culture media that enables accurate pathogen detection or the reference materials anchor method validation. We also kind of think about and consider rapid detection platforms that compress time to result and then do so in a way that doesn't sacrifice sensitivity. We have individual products around our environmental monitoring workflow from start to finish at every level. But one of the things we also kind of think through is not just specific products, but kind of thinking through what's our job. And really, that seems to be to make sure those foundational tools exist as far as food safety testing and innovation, making sure they're validated, they're accessible, whether you're a global contract lab or a regional quality team at a specialty food manufacturer. And a great example that we've recently launched into the market is our ReadyStream system, which eliminates 5 traditional media preparation steps and removes friction from the microbiological testing workflow so labs can scale up and respond faster when they need to.
I just say that was really well said, Justice. I would say, like, from the food safety community broadly, when you're talking about specific science, I'd say conversations like this one are really critical, whether it's through a podcast, through a webinar, or just in the right room. We're talking about novel protein testing, or we're just talking about the specific risks that arise, the tensions between industry commercialization and regulatory needs, partnerships like this one, partnerships like groups have with AFDO, with GFSI, with these other validation bodies. I think we mentioned AOAC, some others. I think that's really critical. Knowledge sharing is really critical. It's probably the crux of how we need to move forward and maintaining an eye on the risks and how we can address them. It's bigger than any single product. Food risk landscape's also a lot more complex. It's dynamic. We need to be able to stay on top of it. As I said, keep on top of those regulatory surveillance mechanisms, make sure we prioritize that, and then share that with colleagues in ways that can operationalize on their end. And so I think I'm very proud to be able to be part of an organization and be part of even a member of groups like AFTO as well that help to prioritize that information sharing. I think that pushes forward the managing food safety risk in a way that you could not do just with the science alone.
That's well said, Sally. And I was also thinking just quickly on some other organizations beyond AFTO, ACIL, AOAC, IAFP, being a part of an organization that supports truly all those industry partners. Conversations we've had at FDA, USDA, state, local governments, to ensure that we are able to help be part of the solution and to keep consumers safe. And I think it's this message is part of the whole conversation, and really kind of helps to think about uncharted territory isn't about slowing down. It's about building the map as you go, to become, collaborate and connect all the different and best scientific platforms, innovations, instruments together, and link the best partners together so that it's not about being one industry leader, or it's about how do you collaborate and bring the industry up together. And that's why we're so proud to be a part of those conversations and partnerships. And then also thankful for the opportunity to be here today on Food Safety Matters.
Absolutely.
As helping spread the word and helping keep consumers safe.
Absolutely. Well, we're so grateful to you two for coming on the podcast and, sharing with our listeners all of the different, not only strategies for enhancing and encouraging that collaboration that, we're seeing and that we want to see more of between regulators and testing partners, scientific partners, laboratories, food manufacturers, the industry, and, how do we need to respond to these emerging threats and different trends that we're seeing in this increasingly complex landscape that we've discussed today. There's so much food for thought, I think, in this discussion for our listeners. And I really appreciate Sally and Justice, you guys coming on to share your insights with the Food Safety Matters audience today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yes, thank you, Adrienne.
Thanks again to Sally Powell-Price and Justice Jedlicka for this informative conversation, and MilliporeSigma for sponsoring the episode. You can find more information about MilliporeSigma's food safety testing solutions, environmental monitoring technologies, and scientific resources by visiting their website at sigmaaldrich.com. That's sigmaaldrich.com. You can also access links in the show notes of your podcast player or on the episode page on our website at food-safety.com. Okay, we hope that you enjoyed this special episode of Food Safety Matters, and we'll talk to you soon.